We're all still reeling from the attack last night in Washington, D.C. at the Jewish Museum, where a pro Palestinian terrorist gunned down two Jews, Sarah and Yaron. And one of the things that always is striking, I mean, my mind is in so many places, is while I didn't know them personally, I felt like I could have. I probably have dozens, if not hundreds, of friends that are posting on various social media platforms about how they had personal relationships, were good friends, had been in class with, had actually been, the teachers of Sarah and Yaron throughout the last 20 something years of their lives. And just reading their bios, I mean, that easily could have been a friend of mine. It easily could have been myself. It easily could have been a student. And it makes it all the more powerful. And it's one of the things that I think is the most difficult thing for people outside the Jewish community to understand is just how small and how interconnected the Jewish community is. This is just popping into mind, but one of the more powerful things that I think I've ever, helped orchestrate is when I've taken non-Jewish students to Israel. One of the interesting things that always happens is inevitably every time I walk through the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or anywhere else in Israel, I bump into people that I know, either family members of mine that live throughout the land, classmates of mine, people from summer camp, people from youth programs that are now living in Israel. And inevitably, I can't spend a day in Jerusalem without bumping into at least two or three people that I know. And I remember on one of these trips, at the very last day, we were sort of going around and I was asking, a group of non-Jewish students, what shifted their perspective the most, now spending 10 days going throughout the land of Israel, meeting with a myriad of people, trying to really understand, the conflict from a multiplicity of sides. And this one girl, I'm forgetting her name, said the most powerful thing was actually to see how interconnected your life, aka mine, is with the average person just walking through the streets. This is something that, for me as a random American, she said, was just impossible for me to understand when American Jews talked about Israel and talked about the anti-Semitism happening in Israel as directly affecting them and terrorism and what it means when somebody says things like globalize the Intifada and why American Jews, recoil so much from that. She said, now I get it. Now I understand that these two communities are interconnected together. I was looking at, obviously doing a lot of reading about the background of this terrorist. And of course, he was very involved in the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is of course, far left Marxist pro-Palestinian group. And he was about 30 years old, right? So he was, roughly my age. And one of the things that I'm seeing, and this is, the main reason why I wanted to record something quickly today. I obviously don't think I have much to add in terms of how sad this is and how terrible this is and how scary this is for the average Jew. It is all of those things. But the one thing that I wanted to add is I've been seeing now on social media and people texting me and calling me and saying, wow, this was a deranged and insane person. And I want to push back on that. I want to actually suggest that this terrorist that gunned down two Jews last night was a perfectly sane and rational being. Now, we'll see in a second, in my opinion, that makes this all the more scary. But I want to give the argument for this. Being crazy, being deranged, being irrational means being random and unpredictable, right? If I go out and there's no rhythm or rhyme for what I'm doing and, a third-party observer can't rationally trace the steps of what I'm doing, right? That's called somebody being irrational or insane or deranged or everything like that. This person was fully rational, fully understood what they were doing within a wider belief system. And I want to go even further than that. Let's talk about anti-Semitism writ large. I've talked about medieval Christian anti-Semitism much on the podcast and how the medieval church blamed the Jews every time a baby went missing, aka a blood libel. The Black Plague, something that wiped out between 20 and 40% of Europe, was blamed on the Jews. And I'm going to suggest that was totally rational. It was rational for the medieval church to blame the Jews for the Black Plague. It was rational for the Cossacks to kill tens of thousands of Jews in the 1600s, who they believed to be just puppets of the Polish government in the Chmielnicki massacres. It was rational for 19th century intellectuals the world over to blame Jews for financial collapse and eventually the world wars and running the media and running the banks. And yes, it was rational for Hitler to kill 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. And it was also rational last night for this terrorist to kill two Jews. What do I mean by this? I mean that ideas matter. If people have rotten ideas, if people have ideas where they believe that Jews are behind the scenes and controlling everything and trying to destroy society and trying to murder people, it is rational for them to take action against Jews. This is the important part of ideas. Calling this person insane, this terrorist last night, lets him off the hook. It lets the entire anti Semitic, anti Israel movement off the hook by just saying, oh, this is just a, one irrational, deranged person. No, this is the push that the entire movement has been making over the last year and a half. The idea of by any means necessary and globalize the Intifada. This is quite literally globalizing the Intifada. This person might be one of the most rational actors within the globalize the Intifada movement, because everybody else who's saying globalize the Intifada is just typing it in to a keyboard and holding up signs while, of course, covering their face at protests, either on campus and city hall or in the streets of European and American cities. This person is the most rational because he is the only person to say, hey, we're chanting this thing, globalize the Intifada and by any means necessary and everything. What if we actually do it? This is the power, the potent power, the dangerous power of ideas of anti-Semitism and the like that we've been seeing throughout the last year and a half. I'll give you a thought experiment. If I become convinced that some random person on the street, is coming to kill me, it is a rational thing for me to do to try to kill them first. And so if you're a third party actor, it wouldn't be reasonable or helpful for you to say, well, Daniel, it's irrational for you to try to kill that guy because from my perspective, no, he's trying to kill me. If you want to try to snap me out of this, you actually have to question my baseline assumption. Well, hey, why do you think this person is trying to kill you? Right? This is the battle of ideas that we're waged in. It does not help to say this person was an deranged, crazy person, because eventually there will be hundreds of and thousands and tens of thousands more like him who are going to rationally act based on the anti-Semitic ideology that they are holding, that they are being propagated by these far left groups, by these Islamist groups, by these anti-Israel groups. And more people are going to continuously do acts like this. This is not the first, and this will not be the last, sadly. Anti-Semitism has always been based off of people holding false beliefs about Jews, rooted in some sort of conspiratorial thinking of the Jews behind the scenes doing something nefarious, either causing death or causing disease or causing plague or causing war or, causing financial collapse or everything like that. If somebody holds those beliefs about Jews, it is rational for that person to take action against Jews. This is why anti-Semitism is fundamentally different than other forms of racism and bigotry. Most forms of racism are just general in-group, out-group, sociologic and psychologic phenomenon. Not to say anything about how good or bad, right? I'm not making normative claims here, but generally social psychologists have been teaching us for 100 years already that if you separate people into different groups, group A is going to think more highly of themselves than group B, right? That's generally how racism works, right? You have separate groups, and so people start to think, well, our group must be better and that group must be worse, right? But you're not making conspiratorial claims off of that group trying to destroy all the fundaments of society. That's anti-Semitism. That's the idea of anti-Semitism rooted in conspiracy. And this is, again, why ideas matter. I don't think it's a coincidence that over the last couple of days, this idea that 15,000 Gazan babies were going to die based off of Israel not giving aid, which turned out to be a complete fabrication. I believe multiple news outlets such as the BBC were propagating this. And then, of course, all the, social activists in the West were, retweeting this long after the original report had actually been shown out to be completely false. This was a blood libel. This is no different than in 13th century England, when a boy goes missing and they say, well, it must have been the Jews based off of zero evidence. Guess what happens? The next months and years are filled with pogroms, and eventually Jews are expelled from England. And eventually the virulent type of anti-Semitism that is propagated by things like the blood libel end up sticking around hundreds of years later, so that when people like Chaucer and Shakespeare are writing in the 16, 17, and 1700s, they are propagating anti-Semitic ideas, even though there's probably a reasonable argument to make that Shakespeare never actually met a Jew, but these ideas were so nestled into his mind based off of these conspiracies that for him, Jews are, of course, these greedy, awful people who can't be trusted, right? This is the importance of ideas. And yes, this means that anyone propagating these ideas is in some way directly responsible for the murder of these two Jews last night. If you are going around saying that Israel has a desire to kill babies, that Israel is just trying to destroy as many Palestinian lives in Gaza as possible, and that this is Israel's goal, and Israel has some, blood-hungry desire, and that implicates, any Jew in the world who's connected to Israel, which is, by the way, almost all of them, you are directly responsible for somebody saying, well, the way to stop that is to then, shoot random Jews who are a part of this support. This is the battle that we are waged in. This is the potency and the danger of people holding ideologies based off of conspiratorial thinking that Jews are just here to push nefarious things into society. And anybody who wants to be on the right side of history, I mean, this is so clear and it's so obvious. Anybody now propagating these ideas, anybody who says globalize the Intifada, anybody who says by any means necessary, you are directly responsible for these two Jews being murdered last night. And the next time it happens, you will be responsible as well, as well, as well. The last thing that I want to say is, you know, there's been a lot of talk, and I've, thought about this a lot on the podcast. And so people who have listened to other episodes know, this conversation about, is the golden age of American Judaism over? Or are Jews less safe in America? The answer is obviously yes. Jews are less safe in America than we were 10 years ago. Jews are also less safe everywhere, including Israel, than we were 10 years ago. But more so than any other time in my life, and even the life of the last generation of Jews, most of the Jews at least, the idea of political Zionism, the idea that Jews need an army and we need our own government, was always sort of theoretical, right? Israel as, yeah, it's important just in case, things go to, crap somewhere else. Yes, we need a place that is a strong Jewish-centric government that has at its core protecting Jewish lives. All of a sudden now, political Zionism is now, I think, the only rational position to hold as a Jew. In other words, yes, there are plenty of other reasons to be Zionists. And, I'm happy to talk about the cultural Zionism and spiritual elements of Zionism or religious elements of Zionism other times. But my commitment to general baseline Zionism, that Israel is foundational for the protection of Jews, of course I am. Of course I have doubled down in that conviction, as has the vast majority of Jews in the world. In other words, this act to quote unquote free Palestine, it's actually just strengthening Israel in the long run. And this is the difference, right? The one difference between medieval anti-Semitism and Jews being blamed for blood libel and 2025 Jews being blamed for blood libel is now we actually have a state and a government and an army that can protect us against it. And any Jew who wants to be on the right side of this history, and when Jews are talking in 1,000 years, and, the anti-Israel movement is just in a long line of people who have tried to kill the Jews, going back to Pharaoh and then Haman and then the Romans and then the Cossacks and then the Nazis, right? There's, 30 more that I missed there. And yes, we're going to add the far left deranged, anti-Israel movement there as well with their crazy ideas of anti-Zionism. If you want to be on the right side of that history when whatever holiday Jews create to celebrate our victory over the anti-Israelists, you better start speaking up against this type of virulent anti-Semitism that is ubiquitous within these anti-Israel movements. And you also must redouble your conviction to not just the American Jewish community, but the global Jewish community and the state of Israel.